your course and your conversations talk quite a bit about the brain. And I would love to touch upon it as well, because it is so incredibly critical to understand how, a traumatized brain is different than, a brain of a child who has not experienced trauma. So, you can have two students come into your classroom and they can sit down and they can both be well-dressed, groomed. They can have had breakfast that, morning. They could have had 8 hours of sleep the previous night, but one of their brains might be ready to learn and the other one might not. And for the traumatized student, I've got this brilliant book. It's called The Deepest Well. And I wanted to read a quick snippet out of here that is from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And what she found, referring to ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is that the more symptoms a child had, the higher his cortisol levels. And remember, cortisol levels are those stress hormones. So the higher the cortisol levels were, and the smaller the volume of his or her hippocampus. And, if the hippocampus, you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? The hippocampus is the part of the brain that helps us transition from short-term memory to long-term memory. So it is critical for learning. And even more alarming, if a child experiences one traumatic event, they then went in and they measured the hippocampus again 12 to 18 months later and found that the hippocampi of those traumatized children were even smaller.
Wow.
So if there's not an intervention where, we help these children, internalize what happened and come to terms with it, they continue to suffer from a learning standpoint. And as teachers, I think we really need to be mindful of that, because it's not necessarily something that's worn on their faces, because they can show up in the classroom looking very much like a student who hasn't experienced trauma. But in reality, their brains are very different. So, that's one thing to be mindful of. And the other thing.
Let me ask you this. As I was growing up, if we knew somebody that was having a difficult time or doing so, our comment back to them may be just grow up. But what you're saying is this is not something necessarily that a person can control. Is something that has happened and rewired in their brain.
Yeah, and the word, what I've often heard is that and this can happen also physiologically from a failure to thrive with ACEs. They've shown that, and Dr. Harris in her book The Deepest Well goes through and beautifully illustrates stories about how ACEs tie to failure to thrive. But it means that the development of the brain can actually get hung. Like if you think about it like a computer, it can arrest the development of the brain. And that's why with some of these students, you might look at their, maturity levels, their self-regulation, and they can be grades below, fellow students. And it might be because they've experienced trauma. And another thing that's fascinating about the brain, I love the brain, is if you think about a teeter-totter, we've got two key areas of our brain. We've got our prefrontal cortex. This is all of our executive functioning, self-regulation, planning, purpose, all lives here. Strategic thinking, all here, the prefrontal cortex. And then we've got the limbic center. Okay, the limbic center is where the amygdala lives. That's our fight or flight. It's our survival brain. And what's fascinating is it's like a teeter-totter. When our limbic center is on, our prefrontal cortex is off. So when our students come in and they're flooded with all these stress hormones, it means that their prefrontal cortex, which we need to learn, which we need to self-regulate, is off. Because it's not like you can have both on at the same time. And that's why we've got the cool part of the brain and the hot part of the brain. And you've probably experienced that yourself when you've had that moment of rawr, and all rationality, right? Sometimes all maturity goes out the window.
Yeah, because too much.
Right?
Yes.
It happens sometimes to all of us. But with these vulnerable teens, it happens more. Or vulnerable children, it happens more. because they've got what's called a dysregulated stress response, because they're constantly flooded with cortisol. And that comes with a whole host of physiological results, including effect of the brain, because it literally means that their system is inflamed. They are on fire. They're on fire, and it's hard to learn when you're on fire, right? So that's something that, we as educators need to be mindful of.